Hello everyone, Bag here. With 3.0 just around the corner, those with their finger on the pulse of the meta have recently picked up on a bit of a problem when it comes to the slow but noticeable escalation of power level that comes with every new unit that's released in HSR. As this game has progressed, it has become more and more clear that HSR will take a bit of a different approach to how they handle power creep when compared to something like Genshin Impact. Instead of multi-year-old units being usable, if not replaceable for a small but noticeable improvement, we now have a constantly evolving meta where not staying up to date on the latest and most popular team synergies leaves you at a severe disadvantage. Every new unit has a specific, seemingly non-negotiable spot in the meta for whatever team comp they were made for. And as these team comps go in and out of fashion, the question then becomes this: what will happen to the older units of HSR? Will they just be left to decay as newer units take their place? Or will HSR show love to its entire roster by buffing older units? Now, first off, when I say buffing, I don't mean what happened with Jing Yuan, which we'll get to later. I mean a direct, tangible buff to older characters with the sole intention of bringing them up to at least somewhat of the level of newer units. At first, this might sound completely unrealistic for a gacha game to do. After all, why give extra tools for units who people have already pulled for? At first, there seems to be very little incentive on Hoyoverse's part for putting time and effort into developing that sort of system, but there have been other gachas that have gone the extra mile to do just that. For my primary example, due to my personal experience with it, let's look at Fire Emblem Heroes! Sorry, I just had to do that. In this game, which has power creep that is like 10 times worse than anything Star Rail has put out so far, older units are given a unique resource to use called Dragon Flowers. These Dragon Flowers are a resource that increase the stats of a given unit past the caps that they had when they initially released, with the rule being that the older the unit is, the more flowers that they can receive. This means that as newer units get stronger and stronger, old units get more and more of a chance to get to that same power level, albeit with the extra cost of using this limited resource on them. On top of this system of Dragon Flowers, every update in Fae comes with some old units getting a refined weapon, which can lead to entire new mechanics being introduced, breathing new life into their unique playstyle, in exchange for even more limited resources to actually equip these newly refined weapons. There are a couple of other ways that you can bring up old units in this game, but in terms of built-in mechanics to specifically bring up old units, these are the ones that I want to focus on. Now, to be entirely clear, this is all just a solution in theory, as in practice, Fire Emblem Heroes' power creep is so aggressive and rapid that old units have no real way of keeping up with the newest releases without intense favoritism on the side of the player. These systems are more so just a lifeline to give people the hope that their launch units can be preserved. It's an endless game of catch-up that you can so easily avoid if you just spend some of the game's premium currency for the new shiny units. If a similar system were to be implemented into HSR, it's hard to say if it would act in the same sort of carrot and stick sort of fashion. The power creep in Star Rail is absolutely nothing like Fae. It's a wonder that we still have 1.x units like Ho-Ho and Ranmei that are still cornerstones to the meta. But regardless, the steady rise in power of new units is still noticeable. If a new unit is not in some way an upgrade in some part to their predecessors, it is notable and for the most part criticized. If this trend were to continue, the 1.0 units, or at the very least the 1.0 carries, will be completely removed from the relevant meta by the next few years. So, actually getting back into Star Rail, let's address the new and loud elephant in the room, Jing Yuan and Sunday. The answer to my video title seems to be right there. Jing Yuan has had a rebirth as a completely new unit thanks to a support that was made with him specifically in mind. Without any Remembrance character in the game right now, Sunday's interaction with Jing Yuan has been his primary selling point in promotional material. So it seems like, rather than adding in new resources or mechanics that can give older units an advantage, the tactic within Hoyoverse is to sell the solution in the form of new characters. This ever so slightly rising tide of power creep makes fans of certain characters scared for how long their favorites will be relevant for, and so of course it's justifiable to swipe for a safety blanket for them. This kind of tactic was also done with Acheron and Jiaoshu before Acheron was even considered to be out of the meta at all. Just because, for a lot of people, it was a good enough idea to quote future-proof Acheron with a teammate that took her to the next level. It's the same kind of thinking as to why there's so many sequels for movies over original concepts. It's a much safer bet to package a unit as serving a fan favorite rather than just passing them off as a standalone that might suffer financially if they are poorly received. So it's a smart idea money-wise for Hoyoverse, as instead of giving you false hope of saving your old units through in-game resources, it's your money that proves your loyalty to a character or their playstyle. Now, does this mean that this will always be their only solution to this? In my opinion, no, and I have two reasons to think so. For one, the amount of old units that will be disregarded by the meta will quickly outgrow the amount of dedicated, quote-unquote, character revivers, if we want to call them that. Dill, Jingliu, Seeley, and Blade might benefit from newer supports, but not in a way that makes them any better than their competition who also benefits from those same supports just as much. Jingyuan and Acheron were buffed so hard because their supports were tailor-made with their kits in mind. A generic support can make all units stronger, which means the disparity of newer units and older units doesn't change at all. So, with how the trend of how they treat old units has looked like so far, they either need to change something up, or just commit to the current plan of leaving all but a few of the older units to rot, which would suck. The other reason why I think they will change how they do things is because old kits can only be salvaged to a certain degree. Jingyuan and Acheron's problems were not in their damage, but their frequency of damage. And so, their respective supports helped not only in increasing their damage, as any support would, but in allowing that damage to occur more frequently. But what about other units who don't have that problem? Seeley might benefit from a support that buffs based on speed, and the same could happen with Blade and HP, but what about the generic carries that just don't have the numbers anymore? Argenti, Dill, Jingliu, there's nothing really wrong with their kits, their damage has just been outmatched as time goes on. You could end up like Kafka and Black Swan, where at Black Swan's introduction, she completely revitalized Kafka's place in the meta, but her lackluster damage made her falter eventually all the same. Supports can only be so specialized without just becoming absurd. I think buffs to older units are more likely than a support that's gimmick is just, if you are named Jingliu, you do 100% more damage. Especially when so many of the older units are so important to the story. Like, we can't have 3/4 of the Stellaron hunters dying in a ditch, while they continue to be relevant in every story arc. New players will want them just as much as we want to have a reason to use them. So giving the likes of Kafka or Silverwolf nothing just doesn't make sense. Speaking of which, this whole discussion of reviving characters has only really applied to carries. Without a specific buffing mechanic for older units, characters like Luocha, Silverwolf, and dare I say Sparkle will be left with nothing as units in the meta. I mean, was I the only one who played the 2.7 story quest and saw Yukong and I was like, I don't remember the last time I used her. Now, multiply that to most of the current cast in 3 years from now. It would just feel shitty. And Hoyoverse at that point would be at the very least financially incentivized to do something about it. So to get to the answer of the video's title, I think Hoyoverse's current solution of salvaging older units has a finite shelf life, one that will necessitate another solution in order to keep these older units relevant in any sense. On one hand, they could continue to trickle feed these character revivers, giving enough hope to Seeley and Blade fans to keep them engaged in the game, or on the other hand, they could implement an actual mechanic that brings these units to a better level. Doing so would make reruns more enticing, it would garner better favor from the community, and it would appease the fans of these older units by giving them something new to play with. If anything, they could just use the Fire Emblem Heroes approach and just make these new mechanics overall obsolete in the grand scheme of things, in order to prolong the rotation of metas that fuel this game's profits. Like, who cares if Seeley gets a new augment on her scythe if Seeley's playstyle doesn't fit into any current teams? Seeley might get stronger and her fans might be happy, but you would still pull for newer units, so Hoyoverse still wins. This kind of future would indicate a more overt level of power creep, as opposed to what we've seen in the game so far. But with how this game has trended in comparison to Genshin so far, it trending in that way is not super far-fetched. So with all of that being said, if they did implement some sort of buffing system, how would it work? I don't think that they would just give out free Eidolons, like how Weathering Waves does in its shop, as giving out things that could be bought just doesn't seem very Hoyoverse-y to do. Ratio is still the exception, not the rule to things. If it were to be more akin to Dragon Flowers, they could introduce stackable minor traces, where you could potentially reinvest into the stat bonuses in a unit's trace in order to artificially increase their stats. This wouldn't really be much of a solution, nor would it be very exciting, which, if you look at it in a certain way, would make it kind of up Hoyoverse's alley, but I'd still give this a probably not. So this leaves what would be the equivalent to the refinement system that I talked about earlier, giving units new mechanics in the form of either a new major trace, or as just an entirely new resource and equipment slot. I could genuinely see something like that happening in, say, 2 years-ish from now. So if we extrapolate that to estimate when buffs of these units would come out, it looks like Boot Hill will have some sort of a buff within the next 4 years. In all seriousness, them adding a function like this in the future is the same for me as to whether or not they'll add a Remembrance unit to the standard banner. It makes sense, and I could see it happening eventually, but counting on Hoyoverse to actually go through with it is a bit naive. But let me just be naive. This video will age well, and trust me, I'll be as petty about it as I am morally allowed to be. What do you think is the future for these older units? Let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and let me know if you enjoy the background footage. It was something I used to do in my older videos, and I'm trying it out again here. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye!